Hello, how you doing? My name is Antonio. My page, Unapologetically Black. I ask that you like and subscribe to my page. As we celebrate today, which is Juneteenth, supposedly the day of Blacks' emancipation from slavery. Let's be clear, Juneteenth was not Blacks' emancipation from slavery. All it was the government taking control and taking over the security of slaves. We have to understand that Blacks had never accepted slavery and constantly rebelled against slavery. And each time those rebellions happened, it cost slave owners much more money in order to secure the slaves. Juneteenth, I need us to understand that Juneteenth was not the emancipation of Blacks. What it was the transferring of ownership from Blacks from private ownership to the ownership of the government. You will see that Blacks rebelled against slavery the entire time. Europeans tried to enforce it upon us, and what what happened is the cost of security had increased more and more for white slave owners. So, due to the insecurity of the government of the people who were not slave owners, the government eventually took control of slavery. New York City slave uprising. But between 25 and 50 Blacks congregated at midnight in New York City, New York, on April 6, 1712. With guns, swords, and knives in hand, the slaves first set fire to an outhouse, then fired shots at several white slave owners who had raced to the scene to fight the fire. By the end of the night, 9 whites were killed and 6 whites were injured. The next day, the governor of New York ordered the New York and Winchester militias to drive the, the island. With the exception of 6 rebels who committed suicide before they were apprehended, all of the rebels were captured and punished with ferocity ranging from being burnt alive to being broken at the wheel. Be clear, they don't even know how many was there, so for them to say all of them was captured when they're not even accurate about the number that actually was there just says that they was just going rounding up Blacks and killing Blacks and saying he won, he was one, he was one. But the swift punishment of the guilt was not enough to quell the concerns of slave owners and their political body. Within months, the New York Assembly passed an act for preventing, suppressing, and punishing the conspiracy and insurrection of Negroes and other slaves. Masters were permitted to punish their slaves at their full discretion, not extending to life or members. Remember, even the manumission of New York slaves were deterred by this bill. Masters were required to pay £200 security to the government and £20 annuity to the freed slave deposit. These stringent laws, New York were escaped slave rebellion for only 29 years. So as you see, the insecurity that came with maintaining slavery was increasing. So that also added to the cost far security wise. And you see the government get involved in collecting fees from the very beginning in order to take over control of security of uh, the Black people. And you also see how, and the purpose of the Second Amendment, how whites was placed into militias in order to keep Blacks in line. These militias later became police forces. Stonewall Rebellion, 1739. The Stonewall Rebellion, the largest slave insurrection in British North America, Nearby, begun Nerby on September 9th, 1739, about 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stone River. Taking guns and other weapons, they killed two shopkeepers. The rebels marched south towards promised freedom to Spain, to Spanish Florida, where flags, beating drums, and shouting liberty. On Sunday, September 9th, 1739, the British colonies of South Carolina were shaken by a slave uprising that culminated with the death of 60 people, led by the Angolian named Jimmy. A band of 20 slaves organized a rebellion on the banks of the Stono River. After breaking into the Hutchinson store, the band, now armed with guns, called for their liberty. As they marched, overseers were killed and reluctant slaves were forced to join the company. The band reached the Edisto River, where white colonists descended upon them, killing most of the rebels. The survivors were sold off to the West Indies. The immediate factors that sparked the uprising remain in doubt. What you mean? They were slaves. They wanted freedom. What other? This is the ignorance of white people. What else is needed other than the desire for freedom? What is needed for people to uprise? This is the ignorance of white people. The immediate factors that sparked the uprising remain in doubt. Slavery, fools. A malaria epidemic in Charlestown, which caused general confusion throughout Carolina, may have influenced the timing of the rebellion. So blacks had to be confused in order to want freedom. The recent August 1739 passage of the Security Act by the Southern Carolina colonies assembles may also have played a role. The act required all white men to carry firearms to church on Sundays. Thus, the enslaved leaders of the rebellion knew that their best chance for success would be during the time of church services, when armed white males were away from the plantation. Now, it would make more sense to say, yes, they took advantage of an opportunity to gain their freedom, but to suggest they might have had an outbreak or they might have been delirious from malaria and that made them want freedom is retarded. After the Stone Rebellion, Southern Carolina authorities moved to reduce provocations for rebellions. Masters, for example, were penalized for imposing excessive work or brutal punishments of slaves, and a school was started so that slaves could learn Christian doctrines. In colonies that already had more blacks than whites, the assembly also imposed a prohibited duty on the importation of new slaves from Africa and West Indies. Authorities also tightened control over the enslaved. The assembly enacted a new law requiring a ratio of 1 white for every 10 blacks on any plantation. That passed the Negro Act of 1740s, which prohibited enslaved people from growing their own food, assembling in groups, earning money they rather than their own owners could retain, or learning to read. I want you to see there's a pattern. Every time blacks rebelled, they had to increase the requirement of security they had to pay on the plantation. This increased costs. Right? And with their greed and desire to grow so much and acquire more and more slaves, those who do not own slaves become more and more restless that they will not be able to maintain the enslaved system. This is why the government took over control of slavery. The Civil War was not about ending slavery, but was about who would control the slaves, who would be responsible for the security of the slaves, and the taxes were applied in order for them to be able to afford the security of black people. The Civil War was just your United States government taking you under slavery, taking over the security of the Negroes in America. That's what the Civil War was about. It was not about your emancipation. You are not emancipated right now today. Black people, so what you see is what happened. What was happening is slavery was not feasible to maintain. It was no longer possible to maintain security wise. So what, and you see in early as 1844, the government had already started breaching upon white slave owners far as competing with them far as leasing slaves, because prior to that, North Carolina with white slave masters were very big on leasing out their slaves. So, and it became a point where it had unemployed poor whites so much that locally they had restricted slave hiring, slave leasing. So you have to understand that these things were occurring at the time of the civil rights. Antebellum was the time prior to the Civil War occurring. American government had already stepped into the process of convict leasing when prisons were not a big thing in the 1800s. So slavery was never ended. What had occurred is that the government had took over control of the slaves and had took over responsibility for the security of the slaves, and that's why today you have more people incarcerated and in bondage than you did pre-Civil War. The convict listing system, slavery in its worst aspects. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. While many believe that the 13th Amendment ended slavery, there was an exemption that was used to create a prison convict leasing system of involuntary servitude to fill the labor supply shortage in the southern states after the Civil War. Black codes regulated the lives of African Americans, and justice involved individuals were often convicted of petty crimes like walking on the grass, vagrancy, and stealing food. So what they did was they created black vagrancy codes in order to force blacks into poverty, right? And then basically criminalize them for being hungry. Similar to them choking out the black man on the train because he said he was hungry, the homeless man. So rather than deal with his hunger, they would rather choke him out and take his life. Rather than deal with the fact that they starved you out economically, what America did was they used you as free labor. Arrests were often made by professional criminal hunters who were paid for each criminal arrest, and apprehension often escalated during times of increased labor needs. Even those who were declared innocent in the court were often placed in this system when they could not pay their court fees. Companies and individuals paid leasing fees to state, counties, and local governments in exchange for the labor of prisoners in farm, mines, lumber yards, brick yards, manufacturing facilities, factories, railroads, and road construction. The convict leasing fees generated substantial amount of revenues for southern states, counties, and local budgets, and lasted through World War II. We punished a man who steals a loaf. If he steals an entire railroad, we say a financier. Let us ask him to dinner. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, one of the original 12 companies listed in the Dow Jones Industrial Index, was one of the largest users of prisoners' labor, mostly comprised of African Americans convicted of petty crimes. The number of convicts employed increased after United States Steel, the largest corporation in the world at the time, formerly known as the U.S. Steel and USX, acquired TCI in 1907. The working and living conditions for those prisoners were brutal, and companies leasing convicts sought to house, clothe, and feed them for minimum expenses, with little interest in their survival. Justice-involved individuals were housed in rough, broad shanty units unfit for the habitation of human beings. Torture and beating were common, and countless individuals would perish from abuse, poor and dangerous working conditions, communicable diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, and pneumonia, and from environmental conditions like contaminated water. The normal wages given to the prisoners' laborers drive honest labor out of employment and into starvation, which create more crime, which is tails, give them a higher labor force. So this is what all you black people who talking about this, keep the police force, don't defund the police. This is the purpose of the police, is to re-enslave you and your children. Convict leasing undermines competitive labor markets and decreases living standards by reducing wages and employment rates among the free population. Government use of prison labor can distort incentives for incarceration, particularly in the for-profit prison system. The Cold Creek War was an early 1890 armed labor struggle across Tennessee that was launched against the state government convict leasing system. The labor movement fought against it because it resulted in suppressing employee wages and increasing unemployment. At the same time, manufacturers railed against the system because they could not compete against companies deploying cheap convict labor. So while they telling you to achieve economic freedom and independence, you're going to have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You must be clear and understand that they pulled themselves up off of your bootstraps. Even other white companies complain that they cannot compete with free labor. They built these institutions and resources off of free labor and now expecting you to compete against your own forefathers' labor. We celebrate Juneteenth because the ideal of emancipation for black men and women still should reign free in our heads. Convict leasing was a system of forced penal labor, which was practiced historically in the southern United States. The labor being mainly African American men, it was ended during the 20th century. It provided prisoners' labor to private parties, such as plantation owners and corporations. The state of Louisiana leased out convicts as early as 1844, but the system expanded throughout most of the South with the emancipation of slaves at the end of the American Civil War in 1865. The practice peaked about 1880, was formally outlawed by the last state, Alabama, in 1928. And persisted in various forms until it was abolished by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. via Franklin Budio or whatever. The, the system was highly lucrative for both leasees. The state government, for example, in 1898, 73% of Alabama annual state revenues came from convict leasing. Corruption, lack of accountability, and violence resulted in one of the harshest and most exploitative labor systems known in American history. African Americans, mostly adult males, due to vigorous and selective enforcement of laws and discriminating sentencing, comprised the vast majority, through not all, of the convict leasing. While states of the northern United States sometimes contracted for prison labor, the historian Alex Literature notes that only in the South did the states entirely give up its control to the contractors, and only in the South did the physical penitentiary become virtually synonymous with the various private enterprises in which convicts labored. It was a form of bondage strictly different from that of one antebellum South, in that for most men and the relatively few women drawn in, this slavery did not last a lifetime and did not automatically extend from one generation to the next, but it was nevertheless slavery, a system in which armies of free men guilty of no crimes and entitled by law to freedom were compelled to labor without compensation, were repeatedly bought and sold, and were forced to do the bidding of white masters through the rigorous application of extraordinary physical currents. Convict leasing in the United States was widely in the South.